Here we are at the start of 2025. Where do things stand today in American agriculture? Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams are the founders of Understanding Ag, and collectively, the team at Understanding Ag has consulted on over 36 million acres. What have they learned about where we're at in agriculture today as a whole in America?
It was 183 degrees. Now, I don't know about you, Clay, or you, Gabe, but I don't cook my meat to 183 degrees. I consider it burned and ruined at that. If we are heating our soil up to that, what are we doing? We are literally, not figurative, but literally cooking our soil.
So think of what that does for evaporation. You're not in a drought. You just have a non-functioning water cycle. Quite honestly, we can repair that rather rapidly.
We're going to discuss that and how do we start to repair this broken water cycle with Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to welcome Understanding Ag back as the studio sponsor for 2025. Be hearing more from them. We'll be doing a couple more episodes each month this year, or at least another episode each month this year than we did last year with the team at Understanding Ag, continuing to talk to their great consultants and some of the people there on the team, and hearing more about the opportunities that they have for you to work with them as a consulting agency. Also, hearing more about the opportunities that you will have in 2025 to understand one of their great, to attend one of their great soil health academies. I was able to go in 2024, and it was a very practical experience. At the Soil Health Academy, the team there is constantly asking you, what do you see, and helping you to understand what you're seeing and helping you to understand what it means. What is what I'm seeing? What does that actually tell me? And what does it mean I need to do differently to influence it in a more positive direction? It was just such a really practical time out in the field and getting your hands in the soil and being able to see what's going on and having them there to help you train your senses to understand what you're seeing, not just what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're smelling. And so, yeah, highly recommend the Soil Health Academy as one of the opportunities for continuing education for you and your operation in 2025. As I said, we're going to talk to Dr. Alan Williams and Gabe Brown today about the state of American agriculture in 2025. This is going to be a part one. We will have more of this discussion coming up in a couple of weeks. We'll pick it up for part two. But right now, we're going to dive into part one of my discussion with Gabe Brown and Dr. Alan Williams. Here it is. Gabe, Alan, thanks for joining me on the Working Cows Podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, always good to start the year, kind of thinking about where we're at. Where are we as an industry? Where is ag as a whole? Where is regenerative agriculture? And kind of what are some of the things that we need to pay attention to in the coming year? So I'll just kind of turn it over to you guys for a little bit and kind of get a sense of where you think we're at in agriculture and regenerative ag.
Well, thank you, Clay. There's been so much that has happened here over the last several years, and even over the last year. Obviously, one of the things is we're looking at a change in administration, and that's certainly going to have some impacts. We have a lot of new knowledge, that things that we have discovered over the last several years, and even in the last year, that are also going to have a major impact as we move forward. Farm economics, ranch economics have been very challenging. It's getting more and more difficult for farmers, ranchers, growers to be able to pencil out really reasonable net profits in their operations. Input costs have risen dramatically over the last 5 years. And COVID seemed to really heighten that, but it hasn't really eased up much, since the pandemic. So we're seeing an ongoing increase in input cost, but at the same time, we're not seeing in many of our ag commodities, a rise in price, a rise in value, particularly on the commodity side of things. So that brings increasing pressure. Interestingly enough, over the last 3 to 4 years, we have seen record highs and near record highs in the beef cattle sector. And yet, in spite of that, we have many, many ranchers that are barely eking out a net profit, or they're not doing that at all. And we're actually seeing more ranchers that are going out of business. Then some of the other challenges that we've had over the last 3 to 4 years have been weather related. We have seen ever increasing and encroaching drought across the breadth and depth of North America, spreading from west to east. And I still remember just a month ago looking at the U.S. drought monitor, and more than 3/4 of the U.S. from west to east, was under anywhere from a D1 to D4 drought in November. So that has really not eased up. But on the flip side, when we do get rain, those rainfall events tend to be more sudden and more severe. So they're creating flooding. And we have this conundrum where we can't infiltrate water very well across the breadth and depth of our landscape in North America. And so if we're getting too much moisture, that's a problem because it's running off very rapidly and creating flooding and erosion. Or if it's not raining, we've got no moisture retained in our soil. So everybody is experiencing drought conditions much quicker. And that is leading to wind erosion. So we're seeing a combination, and it's a rather deadly combination of both wind and water erosion. And over the last 3 years, we have actually seen in the exact same area wind and water erosion literally within days of each other. And that just simply should not happen. So there's many other things that we can mention, and I'm going to ask Gabe to chime in here as well. But to me, those are some of the major things that we have seen that have been challenges to us.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a bit to what Alan talked about with the challenging weather conditions, and realize that the majority of those are actually man-made. They're the result of our practices on a landscape. Now, maybe not us perhaps as individual farmers or ranchers if we're doing a good job, but certainly the aggregate of all of agriculture along with many of the other land-based industries. And Alan mentioned about the lack of the ability to infiltrate water. And at Understanding Ag now, we literally are consulting on thousands of farms and ranches across not only North America, but several other continents. And it's absolutely amazing to me when we send our consultants out, how consistent that lack of ability to infiltrate water is. And we've done some work with all the data that we have, and consistently less than 1/2 of an inch of rainfall per hour. Doesn't matter whether we're talking here in the Northern Plains, whether we're talking in the UK and South America, especially on our tillable acres, our cropland acres, less than a half of an inch per hour. And we often hear people talking, well, they're in a drought, even though they just had a rain a couple weeks ago. Well, you're not in a drought. You just have a non-functioning water cycle. And we can, quite honestly, we can repair that rather rapidly if we put our mind to it and implement what we call the 6-3-4, the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes, which we have talked about on this podcast before. So you take the fact that we have way too much bare ground. By that I mean acres where there is not a crop or a cover crop or a diverse perennial mix growing. And then that actually is what sets back the small water cycle, because we don't have those plants actively growing. Growing plants make water. It's as easy as that, simple terms. So we remove that from the landscape. It saddens me to see, as traveling this fall, I really think cover crop acreage following cash crops is actually declining. And I know part of the reason for that is unstable weather. Part of it is farmers are saying, well, I just can't afford to do that. Well, I'm sorry, but you can't afford not to do that, because having that living root in the soil will do more good for your water cycle and nutrient cycle than anything else. We have to get back to these type of practices. And if we're not doing them, we need to implement them in order to increase that resiliency on our farm or ranch.
Gabe, let me ask you a question. How often do we see on our landscape where we get a half inch of rainfall or an inch of rainfall and water is ponding and pooling and running off?
All the time. All the time. And, as we go out on these farms and ranches, the best tool we have besides our senses is a spade, a shovel. And all you have to do is stick that spade or shovel into a cropland field and then go over to the fence line and stick it in, or the road ditch, stick it in, and just look at the difference, and that's all management, or as I prefer to call it, stewardship or lack thereof. And so we have a real issue today in that we have degraded our landscapes to such a point that these wide swings in moisture and temperature are just becoming more and more common. The hurricanes, as Ellen mentioned, drought, flooding because water can't infiltrate, having negative impacts, not only on our own farms and ranches, but also on community and society. And that's why it was a bit disappointing to me anyway, personally, to see them just kick the can down the road and extend the farm bill and think that, this is the answer. The answer isn't throwing more money at it. The answer is we've got to solve the root cause of the problem.
And on the flip side, what we're seeing is that when our soil is not covered and protected or armored, as we say, then we are seeing extremes in soil temperature. It is routine now for us, Clay, to measure soil temperatures in pastures and in row crop fields and under pivots in the summertime at 140 plus. And just this past year, I measured a soil temperature out in western Nebraska of 183 degrees. and I had more than 20 witnesses there. So that's not just me talking. Yeah. And as a matter of fact, when I did that, I had several of them say, wait a minute, hand me that thermometer. I don't believe that. And I let them measure it. And yes, it was 183 degrees. Now, I don't know about you, Clay, or you, Gabe, but I don't cook my meat to 183 degrees. I consider it burned and ruined at that. So if we are heating our soil up to that, what are we doing? We are literally, not figuratively, but literally cooking our soil.
Yeah. So think of what that does for evaporation. I remember back in 2012, I was over in Australia, and the ranch I was on over there, or station as they like to call it, they were talking about how the moisture evaporates and down to a meter deep. And with those type of soil temps that you recorded there, Alan, you can bet that that moisture is evaporating down to considerable depth. And then you look at the compounding negative ramifications of that, and just so happens right before we came on this podcast, I was reading an email from a client of ours in California who was saying in the last year, land prices have dropped from where they're at, and they're in the Central Valley, from 40,000 an acre to less than 12,000 in 1 year. And that's solely because of the challenges with water in the Central Valley of California. And we're seeing that not only in California, we're seeing it in western Nebraska, Kansas, eastern Colorado, western Texas, etc. Water is becoming a major issue, and you have to ask yourself, will that water end up going to the cities, or will it end up going for agricultural use? And what are the ramifications of that on food supply, etc.?
I think it's a safe bet to say that water will go to the place with the most money and the most votes, which is probably not the agricultural sector.
Yeah, I think you're right, Clay. I think you're right. But think of this, think of all these compounding negative effects. And, for many, many decades, farmers, ranchers have not been given credit for all the ecosystem services that they provide and the value they provide besides that of producing nutrient dense food. And I really think that farmers and ranchers right now have an opportunity to set ourselves up to change that narrative, so to speak. And if we change the way we farm and ranch to one that is conducive to having four healthy ecosystem processes, which will have positive effects on not only the ecosystem but society, I really believe it opens up the opportunity for farmers and ranchers to be held in very high esteem and to be rewarded for that work.
Yeah, this desire to know where your food comes from is directly connected to these issues. And almost all the time when people go on that journey of trying to figure out where their food comes from, they end up buying food from somebody who raises it a lot like the way that we would advocate for, because it is a better story and it is a more healthy product in the end. And I think we're coming real close to that time when the barcode scanner tells you how nutrient dense that food is and things like that. And I think it's already happening in certain places around the world. And so those consumer demands are going to change the market. And I think that the consumer is going to demand products that are making the landscape better, not extracting from it. One of the things that you talked about earlier was that it's really uncommon to be able to infiltrate more than half an inch of rain per hour at this point in agriculture, as far as you guys see it, which is over a broad expanse of a number of acres in different places around the world. That, I would say that a half an inch of rain per hour is not exceptional amounts of rain almost anywhere in the world, really. I mean, that might be a heavier rain, in some places at some time, but it's not exceptional. It's not something that should be, you can't plan for that. That's that's beyond the pale of what you can expect to have your land hold up to. It's just not even close to that. Even in the desert, they get the monsoon rains. Well, a lot of those do come in heavy downpours, probably more than half an inch per hour. And here in western South Dakota, we're in a semi-arid environment. Half an inch per hour is not exceptional, and it shouldn't be something that causes runoff and taking topsoil with it as it runs off. So I just think that's an important thing to remember is this is the game, right? We need to be able to hold on to the water we get. It doesn't really matter how much you get if you can't hold on to what you do get.
You're absolutely right, Clay. And look where you're at, western South Dakota there. There's oftentimes you'll get these brief rainfalls that maybe they only amount to 3/4 of an inch or an inch, but they come in 20 minutes. It's just the skies open up, you have that downpour. Well, are you capturing all that? And is it infiltrating? First, it has to infiltrate into the soil profile. And then, do you have the carbon there, the soil aggregation and the carbon, to be able to soak that up like a sponge? And as we travel around with our clients all over the world, no matter where we go, in arable land, approximately, and it varies, but 50 to 75+% of the carbon that was once in those soils is now gone. It's in the atmosphere, and that's due to a variety of factors. Maybe tillage, maybe excess nitrogen application, that there's many factors that could cause that. But we see that over and over and over again, no matter where we go. So not only is it a challenge to infiltrate the water, but then we're lacking that sponge. We're lacking that organic matter, that carbon, which holds on to that moisture. And that's what makes us resilient. And if we don't have that, that's how come so often, like I just talked to a producer in southeastern Missouri who's had over 75 inches of rainfall in 2024. Okay. Yet, if they didn't get rain every 2 weeks, they thought they were in a drought. Okay. The challenge is you have to be able to infiltrate it. You have to have the carbon to hold on to it to give you that resilience.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. Understanding Ag has a team of farmer rancher experts on their team that have been there and done that on their own operation. They have made the regenerative shift. They have walked the regenerative path. They are walking the regenerative path, and they can come to your place and help you understand where you're at and how to get to the next step to be successful on your operation from a regenerative perspective. They can help you figure out how to fix a broken water cycle. They can help you understand how to capture and hold on to more of the rain that you get, more of the moisture that you get. And so check out the show notes page for today for links to get on board with Understanding Ag in 2025. Another one of the things that you mentioned earlier was the fact that we've had record high cattle prices for a number of years, continuing to just eke up and break our own records here. Seems like week after week. But when was the last time, according to the data of people like Harlan Hughes and others, that it cost less to raise a calf than it did the year before? And I think the same can be said on the crop side when we have record high corn and soybean prices, as we did recently in the past. When was the last time it cost less to raise an acre of corn this year than it did last year? And I think that those monies keep ending up in the agricultural business sector's pockets. They keep on inventing new ways and and finding new ways to treat old problems with a new jug, and continue to cost the producer money. And even if we're having record high prices, we're not net profiting any more than we were before. Does that match with your experience?
Let's just look at the beef side of things right now, ranching, and then we can jump into the crops and talk about that. But the average weaned calf now over the last 3+ years, has had a value significantly over $1,000. Okay, $1,100, $1,200, $1,300, and sometimes even more. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, ranchers would have killed for that kind of price for their calves, and would have said, I'll really be making a profit, right? But yet that's where we've been over the last few years. And all I hear is moaning and groaning about how I can't make any money, And so if a calf is worth $1,000 bill plus at weaning time, and you can't make a really nice net profit out of that, we have a problem. We have a very, very major problem. And if you look at the average cost for producing a calf now, the average cost for a cow on a ranch, it is $900+ a year. And way too many ranches is costing them $1,000+ a year per cow calf unit to get them through the year. How did we get to that point? And as Gabe alluded to earlier, that is not a problem other than our own management. If we should be able to raise a calf to weaning at under $600 and even $500, but yet very, very few ranches are able to achieve that right now.
Is it feed costs, input costs, veterinary costs? What is the driving that in your understanding?
Well, yes, and yes. And when years ago, when I was still at the university, for almost 15 years, I ran annual IRM SPA data, where we analyze both production and economic data off of hundreds of ranches. And by far the largest cost category, no doubt, is the groceries that those cows eat on an annual basis. And so, yes, that's a major cost. The most profitable ranches year in and year out were holding that cost in groceries, and that includes the pasture as well, and then all the supplemental feed stuff, hay, everything else. They were holding that cost to 62% or under. Okay. But the problem is that the vast majority were somewhere between 73% and 85% of their total cow cost, being in feed, supplement, hay, and the grass that those animals are eating on an annual basis. So that is the biggest cost category. But the second biggest cost category by far was what I always refer to as heavy metal. The vast majority of ranches have way too much heavy metal, meaning they have too many tractors, balers, rakes, mowers, 1-ton dualies, gooseneck trailers, you keep naming it, right? And they're over-equipmented. And those are things, in the words of the late but great Dr. Gordon Hazard, who refused. He said, I don't want to own anything that rusts and depreciates. And so he truly minimized that. But yet he made literally millions of dollars in the stocker business. So we now have to rethink that. But we get talked into thinking we've got to be doing our own hay. We've got to have a tractor for everything that we do to hook up to every individual piece of equipment that we have, because by golly, we can't be changing tractors with equipment, right? And we've got to have the fancy 1-ton dualies and the best gooseneck trailer, the best squeeze chute. So we get talked into all of those types of things. And then the third cost category is, what I'll call the supplement and vet med. So, the minerals, all of the other supplementations, the protein tubs, you name it. And then, yes, the vet med cost. And that includes parasiticides, insecticides, all of that. So those are the three principal cost categories that we see. But then the fourth, and Bert Teichert would very quickly, talk about this one, is FTE, full-time equivalent personnel per 100 head of cows. And the vast majority of both beef ranches, dairy farms, things like that now have way too many FTEs per number of cows. So when we want to talk about the major cost categories in livestock production, those are the major cost categories.
And just think about how many of those cost categories you just mentioned are in some way solved by a reasonable calving date and a reasonable rotation of your cattle. If you moved your cattle a reasonable number of times per week and calved at a reasonable time of the year, how many of those cost categories would be almost completely eliminated?
All of them. All of them. You would be able to significantly better control every single one of the cost categories that I just listed.
It's a self-licking ice cream cone. I've got the equipment, so I need to find a reason to use it, or a codependent relationship. I have these cows that need me and I need to be needed, and it continues to mean that even with record high prices, we just barely break even.
Clay, I look back on that and think back the years that every day I started a loader tractor, and then I started a tractor that the feeder wagon was hooked up to. And, we can get a little cool here in the Northern Plains. So they were plugged in for several hours each night, and then they were out running, and every day, did that every day during the winter. And when I finally made the switch and light bulb turned on, and I thought, this is ridiculous, and I got rid of that and let cows be cows and go out and graze, the profit increased not just a little bit, significantly. And that's when I really saw the turnaround to a profitable operation. The other thing, though, I'd like to add to what Alan said, though, is it absolutely amazes me how few producers, it doesn't matter whether we're talking crops or livestock, truly know their cost of production, truly keep track and have the means to separate and do enterprise analysis on each of the specific crops or livestock enterprises. That is something that is sorely lacking from most farms and ranches. And how do you know what you need? How do you know what you can afford to sell your production at if you don't know the cost of production? You can't. If I may, Clay, Alan talked about livestock. I mentioned earlier about the farm program, and I fully understand who our audience is here, and that I may ruffle a few feathers, but it wouldn't be me if I didn't. But just how ridiculous the federal farm program is. Most Monday mornings I'm on the plane out of Bismarck, and oftentimes our two North Dakota U.S. senators are sitting across the aisle from me. And I've given them an earful so much about the farm program, they totally ignore me now. But why continue a program which is based on simply more and more production to drive the prices lower and lower because we're overproducing these commodities, and then next year's crop insurance will be based off of those low prices because we produced more and more? How absolutely ridiculous is that? How can anybody except, the fertilizer industry, the chemical industry, the industries that rely on those specific commodities, such as ethanol or some of the big agro-industrial complexes, how can anybody think that's a good idea? It's simply a flawed model that we need to move away from. Yet nobody, it appears, is willing to take the bull by the horns and say, we got to scrap that whole thing. Why? Because there's so many jobs and that are relying on that now. Even look at the grain growing associations themselves, the corn growers, wheat growers, barley growers, list goes on and on. They get paid per bushel, okay? Has nothing to do with profit for the farmer, it's per bushel. So we are told as farmers, we have to produce more and more to feed the world. Alan, could you share with the listeners the statistics you had put together on food waste? Because those would fit in here well.
This is rather staggering. We're continuously told that we've got to produce more and more and have greater and greater yields to feed the world. Yet right now in the U.S., we are wasting out of the food that we produce. For every man, woman, and child in the U.S., we are wasting 389 pounds of food per person per year. Now, Clay, that feeds just the food waste feeds every man, woman, and child in the U.S. Okay. Globally, food waste for every man, woman, and child in the world currently amounts to 173 pounds of food annually. So right now, with just the wasted food that we're wasting here in the U.S. and globally, we could adequately feed every single person alive on the face of this earth. So when we talk about we need to just continuously increase yield, really? No. What we need to be doing are two principal things. We need to be producing foods that are much more phytonutrient rich, nutrient dense, so that we're feeding people better. And we need to make sure that we've got adequate food distribution and we quit wasting what we are producing. So those are the things that we really need to be focused on. And, it really continues to just boggle my mind that we are told over and over by the powers that be that we need to produce more food and chase yields. And by the way, if you look at the last 15 years of USDA ERS crop yield data, you look at the three major crops in the U.S., corn, soybeans, and wheat. We have not over the last 15 years successfully increased yield. It's gone up and down, up and down. And the average yield nationwide for all three of those over the last 15 years has remained very static. So, in spite of all of the so-called developments from the new amendments, the new fertilizers, the precision ag, all the technologies, everything else, not any of that has succeeded in truly and consistently increasing our yields. Rather, what we have succeeded at over the last 15 years is further degrading our soils, further reducing nutrient density in the foods that we are producing, and further reducing our ability to be resilient.
Just think about the change that would be driven in the agricultural industry if the commodity groups checkoff dollars came per unit of profit rather than per unit sold. Like you get a cut of the profit from the ranch rather than you just get $1 every time somebody sells a calf or a bushel of corn. Just think about the difference that the change that would drive in the industry. I mean, that's a paradigm challenging idea to think about the fact that, oh, they just get paid per bushel. So their interest is in raising more bushels and who cares how we do it?
That's exactly right, Clay. And you look at how are most planting decisions made? What are the factors that are taken into account? Number one, by far, is revenue insurance. How many dollars can they generate, be guaranteed from revenue insurance? Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. One being that the majority of farmers have to take out operating loans in order to buy inputs. And so the lending institutions require them to take part in the federal farm program. But we need to understand that most of the dollars from this government support does not go into farmers and ranchers' pockets. It goes straight to landowners, input suppliers. We have a client that I was working with earlier this year. When they came to us, they were paying $600 an acre cash rent annually, $600 an acre. And I'm like, how does that make any sense? Corn currently somewhere around $4. That means 150 bushels an acre just to pay your rent. Come on. That just makes no sense at all. Yet we see it over and over again. And that's one of the many unintended consequences from a flawed farm program, is that it's not supporting our rural communities by any means. It's not supporting the farmers and ranchers, right? It's supporting others outside of our communities.
So, Gabe, how long have we had incentive programs?
Long time, yeah.
And how much have any of those moved the needle?
None. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking incentive programs from FSA or incentive programs from, for instance, NRCS to do a practice. We know, historically speaking, adoption rates, once you remove that incentive, 12 to 14% long-term, historically speaking. That's not wise use of taxpayer dollars.
I'd be willing to bet you $1 to a donut that most of those 12 to 14% were already doing it before the incentive, before they enrolled, or were going to do it anyways.
You're exactly right, Clay.
In the time that we have left, and we're going to continue this conversation in a part 2 that'll be out in a couple of weeks and talk more about what this means for national security and some of those things as well. But where do we start? How do we address these issues? I mean, it seems to me, and you guys can correct me if you think I'm misguided here, but it seems to me a lot of the issues are related to the fact that farmers are looking to the government to provide them a safety valve for their operation. And so how do we get them off of that? What's the detox program for that, and is that the right symptom? Am I pointing at the right symptom, do you think?
I'll give you my opinion on that, and then I know Gabe has a lot to say about that. But again, historically, these incentive programs have not worked. And one of the principal reasons they have not worked is because there is no educational requirement attached to them. Farmers and ranchers do not inherently know how to farm and ranch regeneratively. If they did, they would be doing it because it does have that much value and that much benefit. So they don't know. Therefore, incentive programs do not inherently change behavior and practices. Okay. So if we want to really change this, what we need to do is, if we're going to have incentive programs, then there must be an educational requirement attached to that. And that farmer or rancher, before they can qualify for that incentive payment, must clearly demonstrate that they have received an education that allows them to be able to allocate and implement those dollars that they're receiving in a very productive way. Now that's my opinion, Gabe.
How many other industries have anything, let you go without continuing education? I mean, CPAs, teachers, insurance agents, just keep going, right? All of them require, some of them like 40 hours a year of continuing education to maintain a license.
Even veterinarians,
right?
Have to get, continuing ed credits and so forth. But the only sector are us farmers and ranchers.
Now I can think of one more. Lawmakers. There's not a lot of continued education there. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. I certainly agree with Alan that education is lacking, and I've made this comment a number of times, and some people get offended by it, and if they do, tough, get over it. If I stand up at a meeting of farmers and ranchers, and I ask that group how many people can explain how a soil aggregate is formed, or how many people can explain the nutrient cycle, the natural nutrient cycle, I'll guarantee you, usually less than 5 for sure, probably only 1 or 2. And yet that farm or ranch's profitability hinges on them knowing how to produce an aggregate, how to capture solar energy. The only form of true wealth-making ability we have is solar energy. It doesn't cost us, okay? Yet they don't understand this. And we have gotten so far out of line with this current farm program that it's become, and I'm going to catch static, Clay, I'm stirring the pot today for you, buddy, but it's become an entitlement. And Alan touched on it there when he said, and you said that we need to have the education that goes along with it. And everybody appears to think that they have the right to farm or ranch. No, it shouldn't be that way. It just shouldn't be that way. Instead, we're propping up oftentimes poor production practices that are leading us down a path of degradation, quite frankly. Now, I have to say, I'm all for personal property rights. I don't think we should be forced into doing something. But and having us do things against our will. But in saying that, why do many farmers and ranchers believe that it's the taxpayer's responsibility to keep them on that farm or ranch? Now, if they think that, they need to walk into their bathroom, look in the mirror. There's their problem. Okay. It's not our urban cousins, so to speak. They shouldn't have to write the check to subsidize our farm or ranch. And this gets back to, well, farmers and ranchers think they're feeding the world. I challenge you today, how much of what's being produced on the majority of farms and ranches is really going for human food consumption?
Well, I mean, how much of it is able to be eaten without massive amounts of processing? I mean, aside from the fact that most of it needs to be cleaned from all the pesticides, but how much of it can be eaten right now without a huge amount of processing? Soybean, corn, wheat, all going to require processing.
Well, and even look at the corn crop in the U.S. What percentage of the corn crop goes directly for human consumption? Less than 3%. Okay.
And when you do raise corn for human consumption, you don't sell it for $4 a bushel, you sell it for $15 a pound. Yeah. I mean, popcorn, bloody red butcher corn, people are looking for exotic corn meals to make better tortillas or whatever, and they'll pay for it. And I mean, the solution is there. It's in front of everyone. It's available. And I think the demand is there. Obviously, the demand is there, or you wouldn't be able to charge those kinds of prices, right? I mean, Economics 101, supply and demand. If you have more demand than you have supply, the prices go up. So obviously the demand is there, and the demand is there for a lot of people to make good money and still have more room for people to join in the industry. So I think there's opportunity. Just do the people want to take it, right?
Yeah.
And ironically, the majority of farmers and ranchers in the U.S. today eat nothing that they grow or raise on their farm. Row crop farmers aren't sitting down to a plate of field corn for dinner. They're not sitting down to a bowl of soybeans for dinner. Even the vast majority of ranchers no longer are fattening a steer or a heifer to harvest to feed their own family. They're going to the grocery store and buying their beef like the average consumer. Most farmers and ranchers aren't even growing their own garden anymore. But yet they're consistently making the statement that I'm contributing to feeding the world, but they're not even feeding their own family. They're buying all of their food from the store or from restaurants and eating fast food as much as any other consumer out there is. And to me, that's hugely ironic. And when they say, oh, I'm producing nutritious, very flavorful food, well, how in the heck do you know? You're not eating any of it. So, that's a problem. If you won't eat your own production, why in the world do you think a consumer should buy and eat that?
I have to mention this, and it's going to get me in trouble, but I really don't care. One of my flights out of Bismarck, I'm sitting next to our state ag commissioner, and he was flying off to a foreign country on a trade deal. And I had to let him know what I thought of shipping wheat from North Dakota to an African country. How does that make any sense economically, ecologically, from a profit standpoint for the farm or ranch? Because they're not being paid anymore because it's being shipped to Africa. They're getting the same amount as any wheat that stays local. We've morphed into this production model in agriculture that it just does not make sense from so many reasons. for so many reasons in so many different ways. And we need to change that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, like I said, we'll pick this conversation up for a part 2 here, and people will be able to check that out as well in a couple of weeks. But for now, gentlemen, I wanted to say thank you for joining me. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you, Clay. Really appreciate it.
As always, very good stuff there with Gabe and Alan. Very excited to be able to discuss next week on the Working Cows podcast with TJ Ellicott from the Wine Glass Ranch. We're going to talk to him about the process that they've gone through over the last number of years, really decades, for developing these wine glass easy keepers. And they will be selling the heart of that herd, the good running age cows out of that herd in Oglala, Nebraska at the end of March 2025, and we're going to talk to them about how you can get your hands on these wine glass easy keepers. So encourage you to check that out next week on the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you again real soon with another episode.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.